Satyagraha, Truth Force, is a movement of Sikhs and Jains and Buddhists and Christians and Hindus and Muslims and non-religious people. In fact, Gandhi's closest companion in Satyagraha was probably a Muslim, Badsha Khan, often called the Frontier Gandhi. King comes back to Montgomery, Alabama, steps up in the pulpit of a provincial church in the American South, and the year is not yet 1960, and he speaks these words, "O God, we call you this name. We know some call you Elohim. We know some call you Allah. We know some call you the unmoved mover." I mean, think about the vastness of that interfaith consciousness at that time. In 1963, King comes to Chicago to give one of his famous speeches at the Chicago Conference on Religion and Race. He quotes from the Hebrew prophets, Amos in particular, "Let justice rain down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." And in the back of that room is an Orthodox rabbi, barely escaped Hitler's death camps in Eastern Europe, Abraham Joshua Heschel, 6 weeks away from being burned at Auschwitz. And he listens to King, and he says, the soul of Judaism is at stake in this movement. And 2 years later, he marches with King in Selma. He's the guy with the big beard and that famous picture of King and the others at Selma. And afterwards, he writes, "It felt like my legs were praying." Right? That's America. You know, that's America. And I'm watching this happen. I'm watching this happen. And I'm thinking that there's this great line by W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American scholar, 100 years ago. The problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And it was. And it is. But it's not the only problem in the 21st century. We also have a faith line in the 21st century. And the problem is how we define the faith line. And what I would like to suggest is that we have to import King's definition of the color line into how we view the faith line. Because Du Bois didn't ultimately define who the color line divided. It was King who offered the most insightful, powerful definition of that. And King said the color line does not divide white people and black people or Easterners and Westerners. The color line divides people who would live together as brothers and people who would perish together as fools. And the worst thing we can do is to define the faith line as Christians versus Muslims, or as secularists versus believers, because that will write us into an endless war. 1.3 billion Muslims on the planet and 2 billion Christians. Let me tell you something. You pit those two groups against each other, we're never going to stop fighting these wars. The only way to define the faith line in a way where everybody wins is to define it as pluralism versus totalitarianism. Pluralism is a one-line definition. Building a society where people from different backgrounds live in equal dignity and mutual loyalty. That's pluralism. Okay? Totalitarianism has a one-line definition. People who want only their group to dominate and everyone else to suffocate. Right? Our job in America and increasingly around the world is to try to nurture pluralism. When I got out of college, I decided this was the path that I wanted to follow. I was convinced that the faith line was going to be the central challenge of the 21st century, and I started going to interfaith conferences to try to figure this out. And what I saw at interfaith conferences, a lot of them in the Bay Area, by the way, I thought it was great. It was remarkable. It was, people talking about shared values between different religions, people speaking about interspirituality. But I looked around, and it was a lot of, frankly, senior theologians. It was the folks who run polls. It was older people. Now that's great, but I got to tell you something. If religious extremism is a movement of young people taking action, and interfaith cooperation is a movement of senior theologians drafting documents, we lose. Right? We are at a point of a huge youth bulge around the world. 85% of the Palestinian territory is under 33. Median age in Iraq, 19.5. Over 60% of India and Pakistan, under 26. What are the religious identities of those young people going to be? And in the most interactional period in human history, where they're not just a Hindu in India, they're a Hindu in India knowledgeable about Jews in Israel, Christians in America, Muslims in Jordan, and they're asking themselves, who am I amidst all of these people? Who is not only helping shape their interaction, their identity, but their identity in interaction with others? And that's why I started this organization called the Interfaith Youth Corps. Because I think that one of the most important things we can do right now is to have a movement around the world that says to young people who are somehow connected to a religious tradition, and by the way, that's about 3 billion people on the planet, right? If I'm like a marketing guy, I mean, that's like I'm salivating. You know, that is a huge market, right? How do we make sure that their interactions with each other are going to lead to pluralism, are going to lead to societies where people live together in equal dignity and mutual loyalty? I want to tell you the dream of this organization. I was talking to Carl Pope yesterday. He's the head of the Sierra Club. He happens to be married to my aunt, so I get access to him quite often. And one of the things we were talking about was that the Sierra Club is not just an organization. The Sierra Club was the first institution in a movement and a field. If you walked around saying 120 years ago that you were an environmentalist, nobody would know what you were talking about. It didn't exist. It wasn't a category. It wasn't a term. Right? It took people like John Muir, who came to this part of the world about 100 years ago and said, show me someplace wild, went to the Redwoods and founded an organization called the Sierra Club and built a category called environmentalism, a field and a movement that put an idea into the culture. And the idea is that the earth is precious and needs to be protected. That's the goal of my organization. It's not just to build an institution, but to be the first institution in a field and a movement that says young people around the world need to be coming together in ways that build understanding and to serve others. And this is happening in Amman, and it's happening in Cairo, and it's happening in Bombay, and it's happening in Belfast. It's a big idea that's implemented in a variety of ways all over the world. I want to tell you something very scary. It's a paper that I read not long ago, done for the Carnegie Endowment. Religious extremism was built on philanthropy. Right? That it was the paper was about how these things get funded. Right? And this guy did research on this and said it's not particularly government money that's coming in, it's donors that are coming in. And what strikes me about the work that we do at the Interfaith Youth Corps is that if you say, I work in human rights, there are philanthropic categories called human rights. If you say, I work in environmentalism, there are philanthropic categories called environmentalism. But if you say, I work in interfaith cooperation, you better hope that the program officer likes you. Because there's no category. But why not? Why not in an age where people from different backgrounds are coming together more frequently and intensely than ever before, where young people are on the front lines of a clash of civilizations, where people increasingly think that the only way Muslims and Christians can interact is by killing each other, right? Why aren't we investing in the alternative, in movements, in forces, and institutions that are imagining a different world and then building it? I want to leave you with pieces of 2 poems. One, Gwendolyn Brooks, called Boy Breaks Glass. It's spoken as if she were a young person. She says, I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration. It's the power and the impact of young people. Which direction is it going to go? Second, A Ritual to Read to Each Other by William Stafford. I think American democracy all over the world depends on this ethic. If you don't take the time to get to know me, and I don't take the time to get to know you, then a pattern that others made may prevail in this world. And following the wrong God home, we could miss our star. Those who are awake, they must be awake now, or else a falling line may lull us back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, must be clear now. The darkness around us is deep. Jazakallahu khair. May God give you goodness.